Kia ora koutou, nice to see you all remotely. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Sylvie, I'm the Head of Platinum Services for MyHR, and I'm joined by my colleague Julian, who's our Services Manager from Australia. So today is a Trans-Tasman webinar. Hi to our friends from across the ditch and to everyone around New Zealand who's joining us. The topic today is remuneration and pay. It's a pretty heated conversation at the best of times, and with the cost of living rising at the moment, excuse me, as well as being off the back of a couple of years of pandemic challenges of many shapes and sizes, we figured now would be a good time to have a conversation around what pay is for, which sounds a bit trite, but you'll see what I mean when we get into the details, to talk about some strategies for how you might want to manage pay in your organisation, some things to stay ahead of, and also, of course, how to manage those pay conversations with employees. So before we get into all of that content, a bit of housekeeping. This session will be recorded and will be made available after we wrap today. So if you have any technical challenges, if you have to duck off unexpectedly, or if you're watching it later on, again, it will be recorded and will be made available on all of the MyHR channels. This does mean, of course, that if you ask a question and we answer it at the Q&A session at the end, that question will be available in a public space. So make sure that you scrub any identifying details and let us know if you want it to be asked anonymously. We'll do our best. If you do have questions, we will be collecting them all the way through the session and answering them at the end. So you're welcome to pop a note through if something comes to mind, or if at the end of the session you'd like to ask us something, then that's totally fine. And Julian and I will split question answering responsibilities probably. So one last thing just around some caretaking. It's been a really challenging couple of years, and I know that I'm feeling pretty pandemic out in terms of fatigue. So if you or someone you know is having a tough time, if you're feeling irritable or a bit worn down, or if you're just not coping for whatever reason, that's really normal. It's been a really challenging time, and there's nothing wrong with feeling like you need a bit of extra support. So whether that's reaching out to a friend or a loved one, if you have EAP services available, or if you wanted to go and talk to your healthcare professional, your GP, I would just take this moment to remind you that it's okay to ask for help and to encourage you to reach out when you need to. So with that said, I will share my screen and we will get into things. Julian is going to be running the first portion of the session. We'll then swap over to myself to take some of the middle content, and then he'll take us across the finish line at the end. So you'll have both of us swapping back and forth a bit today. So I'll just make sure this is working. Bear with me. Cool. And that should be coming through for everyone. Is that working for you, Julian?
Yep, it is.
Nice one. Well, in that case, I will take myself off video and mute and jump back on in a couple of seconds, and I'll hand over to you. I'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Sylvie. And yeah, again, thanks everyone for tuning in for what I think is a pretty exciting topic. Really, today we're looking at remuneration and reward, and looking at it sort of broadly. So as Sylvie mentioned, we're kicking it off by looking at getting remuneration right. So looking at remuneration conceptually, what is the broader impact of how we pay people, and what's the purpose? So what are we looking to achieve? Before we get into that, we'll sort of look at some of the legalities as well. So a really important part of paying people right is understanding our minimum legal obligations, and effectively what we can and can't do, because it's not always clear. And certainly in Australia in the last couple of years, there's definitely been a lot of high profile incidents of businesses not getting this sort of thing right. We'll also look at pay parity. So really looking at that in terms of in-market pay parity, looking at the market, what are our employees or employees like our own being paid out there in the market, and also looking within the company. Are there any differences in terms of how we're paying or how we're rewarding our staff? Sylvie will take us through some remuneration strategies as well. So what are some of the different ways that companies can approach remuneration, why they may approach it in that way, and what are the sort of costs and benefits of each strategy? I think an important part of pay and pay discussions is managing the conversation. So we'll take a look at that. Sylvie mentioned sort of cost of living increasing, really competitive labour market at the moment. after a couple of years of lockdowns and closed borders. So this is certainly going to become, and probably already has for a lot of people, an increasing aspect of employing people. And I think the key thing is it doesn't need to be a dreaded conversation. And so it's really about preparing ourselves for how to go about managing that. And part of that's really thinking outside of the box when it comes to remuneration and reward. What are the non-monetary benefits that can be offered to employees? Can we improve how we structure remuneration packages for performance? And looking at what employees actually want. All right, so let's get into it. So getting remuneration right. So I guess the key thing is obviously money isn't everything, but it's definitely an important factor for employees. In terms of looking at roles, staying within roles, and also how they sort of view and perceive organisations as well. Of course, at the same time, you can read any sort of article about HR or people management, and they'll tell you about a range of things that employees prefer in terms of recognition. But I think when push comes to shove, pay it's a really easy metric for how people can compare themselves against others or look at sort of how their life is tracking. So I think the key thing is, in terms of getting remuneration right, is pay is certainly not everything, but it's definitely a significant part of the story. So looking at a few of these points here, so pay is a hygiene factor. So good pay doesn't just add value, but bad pay upsets a lot of people. So in terms of looking at pay as a motivation or a motivating factor, pay is very much looked as a hygiene factor. So not as motivational as other things, such as like a sense of purpose or potentially relationships within the workplace or autonomy. But it's definitely one of those baseline things that we need to get right in order to attract and retain people. It's a sort of baseline motivational factor of which we can build on other motivating factors in order to obtain greater performance from our employees. So I think it's important to firstly sort of view pay from that point of view. Obviously, pay affects retention. If you're paying poorly compared to your competitors, it's highly likely you're not going to be able to hold on to your employees. So the way we think about it is to achieve a high level of retention and engagement, employers need to consider sort of 4 essential building blocks. So one's performance management, remuneration, rewards and recognition, and succession management as well. So obviously remuneration is a key factor for employees to say. However, it's not the only factor. But we need to ensure that any salary increases, is part of an overall strategy to attract and retain staff. So we're not sort of throwing out big sums of money to retain employees when we know actually retention is actually impacted by other things like motivation or how managers interact with their employees or how teams operate more generally. Of course, recruitment as well. So it's hard to replace someone within the market when you're paying unders compared to your competitors. So I think a good way of thinking about this is, I think more and more as employees aren't just looking at pay, they're looking at pay within a broader context again. So what are the other benefits that we're offering our employees, whether it be sort of additional leave or what sort of, how can we tie this work to greater sense of purpose or meaning for the individual? What are we offering in terms of flexibility? Because I think increasingly employees are sort of factoring in when they're searching for roles and when they're considering roles in the employment market. And of course, reputational issues. So, referrals are a really great way for employers to attract employees. It's a really sort of low cost way of attracting employees. But if we're not sort of paying, that well, then obviously word gets out. Employees aren't referring other people to join the business. And the sort of general reputation of the business sort of extends out from there. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, there's definitely been some high profile cases of late where employers haven't been meeting their obligations, and that has caused great reputational damage to them as well. So the sort of next slide is really looking at considering our minimum legal entitlements. So, really understanding what are the minimum obligations that we have as employers. So there are a robust set of legal minimum entitlements in both Australia and New Zealand. And I think it's fairly safe to say that these are quite rigid and inflexible. So they really do need to form the foundation of any employment offer in either country. So, for example, within Australia, you've got this system that's set up that's based around the national employment standards, which are the sort of 10 or 11 minimum entitlements that apply to all employees. And they're just set in stone. And really, for the most part, there's no real way to be flexible with those in terms of the employment offer. You can't sort of offset a pay increase by deducting from someone's personal leave entitlement, for example. So we really need to understand the sort of foundations of the rigidity of that. Further, looking at collective agreements, and within Australia, sort of modern award entitlements as well, and ensuring we understand, say in Australia, for example, which modern award applies. And for my sort of Kiwi counterparts, the modern award system basically sets minimum entitlements for work within Australia, and these sort of cause pretty big headaches for a lot of employers across the board, and has caused significant issues in terms of compliance for a lot of employers when setting remuneration for their employees. And there's other things on top of that, such as superannuation, KiwiSaver, factoring that into our remuneration discussions as well. Of course, sort of pay methods. So, again, there's quite strong laws around how employees are paid, and ensuring that they're paid, sort of cash or bank transfer. We're unable as employers to control what employees spend their money on, in terms of, making deductions or requiring employees to purchase things from stores and that sort of thing, which I've seen in the past. But also looking at sort of the positive aspects around pay methods. So like, around additional payments. So, commissions and bonuses, and how we can sort of use that to the benefit of the business around, setting goals and expectations and driving performance and that sort of thing. Of course, discrimination is increasingly becoming a talking point around, setting wages, particularly around sort of gender discrimination is a high profile and important issue at the moment. Certainly, again, within Australia, there's a workplace gender equality agency, which is in charge of reporting and enforcing gender pay equality issues, and certainly reports on employers who aren't doing enough in this area as well. So again, going back to that reputational damage, and then also unlawful discrimination under the Fair Work Act and other discrimination legislation as well. And of course, getting it wrong. I've mentioned earlier, particularly sort of in an Australian context where I'm more familiar with, there's been quite a number of high-profile instances of employers who have gotten this wrong, and they've faced legal action, and the costs associated with that, from sort of legal bills to penalties from the Fair Work Ombudsman, back paying their employees these entitlements which they weren't aware they had to pay in the first place. So there's unexpected additional costs as well. And of course, reputational damage, which in some respects is one of the bigger issues associated with this. So yeah, so those are the sort of main sort of I guess legal issues that we think that employers should consider. And I'll hand it over to Sylvie again to sort of talk us through sort of market parity and the issues around that.
Nice one. Thanks, Julian. Hi, everyone again. So market parity is making sure that people in your business are paid fairly compared to what other employers would pay for their skill set. So this is what people normally talk about when they ask about understanding what people are getting paid. It's normally about saying, if someone else was to hire my employee, what could they earn? What figure or salary or wage would be fair for their experience and their skill set? Now, market parity, or understanding what the market would pay for someone, can be really hard to assess because, not surprisingly, pay information is confidential, and certainly there are kind of limited places you can go to get this information to understand really what someone's worth. There is some publicly available pay data, so certain large organisations will publish their pay bands. One example in New Zealand would be, I know the University of Auckland does this, as well as a couple of publicly listed organisations. There are some salary surveys available. Hayes is a Trans-Tasman one, and it's very reputable. Robert Walters does one. Glassdoor, kind of in America, is becoming more and more kind of prominent here, but still getting its way. So it can be difficult to get a good sense of what someone could fairly be paid out in the market. In New Zealand, fair pay agreements are coming. The government is expecting to table this legislation to start making its way through the select committee process early this year, so in the next couple of months. It's similar to the Australian award system in that they would set kind of a floor below which businesses in a particular industry couldn't pay their staff. So all baristas might end up by law being required to be paid $22.50 an hour, for example. So at the point where we have more and more fair pay agreements coming through, that will deliver a kind of potentially unintentionally some pay transparency, because you'll be able to see what it costs and what the rates are under those award systems. So there are legal structures which are coming, which are going to add some transparency here. The reason market parity is important, as Julian touched on earlier, is that if your employee is looking around at what their mates are getting paid and what else might be out there, you run the risk of losing them to a role which pays them a bit more because you kind of weren't tracking or weren't keeping up what's being paid in market. So if this is something that you're mindful of or would like some help for, MyHR will provide remuneration reviews for MyHR members. So we have a database of thousands of businesses and over 25,000 employees whose pay rates are active. Of course, this is all extremely confidential and we aggregate the data we do provide. But drop us through an email to help@MyHRWorks if you'd like to learn more. If you're an existing MyHR client, we can help you in the next couple of weeks. If you're not a client, we can certainly have a conversation with you around what that support would look like. So there is help available out there. We're one of the agencies that can provide that support. So get in touch if you have any questions. Now, moving to internal pay parity. So this is where you want to understand if people in different roles, teams, and levels of seniority are being paid fairly to each other. So what you want to look at, if I was to use a very domestic analogy, because I bought a food processor on the weekend, market parity, which was the slide before, is about going to your Briscoes or your warehouse or your whiteware store and saying, well, I want to buy a food processor. So what's the average price for a food processor? How do I understand what I should be paying for this one particular appliance? Internal pay parity is looking at the rest of your kitchen and going, well, this food processor is going to cost me $250. Is that worth it compared to what I paid for my kettle? Is it worth it compared to what I paid for my dishwasher? Is it worth it compared to what I paid for all of my pots and pans? So internal pay parity is looking at one role or a group of roles and just making sure that your pay rates internally kind of all fit with what's sensible for the business. So a couple of questions you may want to ask if you're just making sure your internal pay rates make sense. Is someone who's earning 100 grand adding twice as much value as someone on 50 grand? Is that kind of fair given their different responsibilities and their different skill sets and their different jobs? Do your pay scales make sense? If you have clear progression within your business, do the jumps in earnings between those different levels kind of accurately reflect the increasing responsibility? If you have a 30K pay difference between your juniors and intermediates, and then only a 5K difference between your intermediates and seniors, does that actually reflect what you're asking your juniors, your intermediates, and your seniors to deliver? Something I like to flag when I'm having these types of conversations around pay, which can be quite emotive, is to ask if you would be happy for the way that you manage pay to be made public. So there is a campaign in New Zealand to require companies of a certain size to publish this information. In Australia, the UK, Germany, Canada, and Iceland, there are varying forms of pay transparency that are required by law. So it's not here at the moment, but it may be coming. And it can be a good yardstick to get a bit of a gut check as to whether you think your pay kind of scales and the way that you pay people differently are fair. Like for like pay parity is the last one that we talk about and can be the one which presents the most risks to businesses, right? Because you're comparing one thing that's identical or very similar to another. So this is where we want to understand, are people in identical or similar roles within your business or your organisation being paid fairly? So yes, of course, you can take into account experience and performance when you're looking at, should this barista be paid $30 an hour as compared to this barista being paid $25 an hour? That's fine. But you cannot take into account gender, religion, parental status, or any of those protected categories, which I know are covered under New Zealand law and Australian as well. So the risks of getting this wrong are quite significant. And like Julian touched on earlier, discrimination is becoming a point of discussion and something that there are increasing numbers of mechanisms to address. So you run the risk of claims of discrimination if people in same roles, so doing the same job, are being paid differently. In New Zealand, we have the Equal Pay Act 1972, which made it illegal to pay people differently if they were doing the same job, particularly for men and women. And the Equal Pay Amendment Act, which came out 2 years ago in 2020, provides a legal mechanism for raising claims of systemic pay discrimination in women-dominated industries. So I'm certainly not trying to fearmonger. It's unlikely much of this is happening in your business, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially if you're doing a company-wide reassessment of how your pay is managed. Make sure that people in jobs which are the same, so your 2 mechanics or your 2 sales managers, are being paid fairly, and that there's not any potential unintentional discrimination that's crept in there. So we're going to jump really quickly into a couple of different remuneration strategies, and I want to touch on these because sometimes when I have conversations, particularly with smaller businesses, the sense is that you always have to keep up with the market, right? So you don't want to pay too little and you don't want to pay too much. And so there's a lot of energy and headspace being spent trying to understand, well, what is everyone else doing so I can figure out what it is that I'm doing. And there's a couple of different ways you can think about pay as a strategy, and we'll cover them quickly here, really just to give you a sense that there are different ways to tackle this question of how do we pay our people. And again, this can be some food for thought or grounds for conversation later. So the first of these remuneration strategies is to pay low wages, is to pay under market. There's no law that says you have to match what the market pays. There's obviously laws around minimum wages and kind of minimum entitlements, but you can choose not to keep up with what the market is paying. The pros of this approach are obviously a cost one. It keeps your wages bill down, and it has much less of an impact on your cash flow because you're not having such significant outlays every pay period, whether that's a week or a fortnight or a month. So this is really common in certain industries where cash flow can be a challenge, certainly in startups or small businesses that are just getting off the ground. This is often a strategy that they employ. It's less common the larger you get as an organisation, but it is a strategy that businesses use, so it's certainly something that happens out there. The trade-off, of course, is that you are likely to need to accept high churn, so people leaving regularly to greener, more cash-rich fields, and or lower employee happiness because they feel a bit hard done by or they feel unfairly treated. Or you need to compensate in other ways. So if you are a startup doing some cool shit, do you have an amazing culture? Are you a business where you have fabulous projects and work that people get really excited about? Are you a charity or not-for-profit? And so people understand that your pockets are a bit shallower than private organisations. Again, super common in passion industries, whether that's entertainment or the performing arts or anything that's kind of glamorous. And one option, if you're certainly in that startup phase, is to look at sweat equity for your employees. So they don't get paid in cash, but there might be an employee share scheme or a shadow share scheme where you can give them a foot in the company ownership door in return for low wages, anticipating that over time it will even out. So paying low rates or paying under market is a choice that you can make. It's important, as with any strategic choice, to think about pros and cons, but have a think about maybe with this is something your business does already perhaps, or something you might want to consider. The most common approach to remuneration, certainly in my experience, is to try and pay market rates. So the benefit of doing this is it takes pay out of the equation when you're competing for talent or for employees with other companies. If everyone's paying kind of within a couple of % of each other, certainly for salaried roles, it's unlikely to lose you any employees because you're kind of paying what others are paying. But it's also not going to be something you can use to swing people towards you because you're kind of paying what everyone else is paying. It doesn't unnecessarily inflate your costs, which is good. Most businesses do have to be aware of their cash flow and their profitability. The cons of this, of course, are that you become vulnerable to employees being unhappy or leaving for other reasons. So paying market rate is certainly, again, as Julian touched on earlier, not the only thing people care about these days. There are other factors which are going to make people more likely to stay or to go. You then can't use this as a tool to say, hey, come and work for us. We pay 10% above market. Isn't that amazing? Come and take a big pay packet with us. So it's kind of a middle of the road approach. Your pay doesn't distinguish you from your competitors in a good way or a negative way. You're just on a level playing field and you're going to keep your employees happy and do cool stuff by doing other things, but not by using pay as a tool. So at the very luxe end of the market, you can choose to pay above market rates. And this is a strategy that Netflix uses. And if you have had a read of the book, which is called No Rules, which was co-written by their chief executive and a journalist, they talk at length about the strategic value that they believed paying above market rates kind of delivered. But in short, people who care about money will come and work for you, and it's really easy to compete with other companies on pay alone. So where you have all of that cool stuff already in place and the only thing distinguishing you from other companies is your pay, choosing to pay above market rates can be really helpful because you look amazing. Not only are you a sexy swish design agency or whatever it might be, you also pay above what they could find elsewhere. And those choices can become really easily comparable because, again, money's a quantifiable number. It's a black and white figure that's an hourly rate or a salary. It's easy to compare. The cons, of course, is it's an expensive strategy to pursue, right? You're having to pay above market rate for a lot of your team, and it means that you spend money on your people and their salary in ways that you might otherwise choose to spend it. The slightly more subtle trade-off is it may keep your employee churn or your employee turnover artificially low. Now, it's really hard to go from earning big money to smaller money, whether you're going from 55 grand a year to 52 grand a year, whether you're going from 200k a year to 150. A drop in pay for most people is quite hard to sustain, particularly as the cost of living increases. This means that you may have people staying with your business who don't actually want to be there, who maybe are kind of looking for a new challenge, feeling a bit complacent and kind of not that energized, who really hate their boss or their colleagues, and who would otherwise move on and kind of maybe take some toxicity with them or even just create space for some fresh blood to come in. You may end up having low turnover, which can be a good thing if all of your people are awesome, but it can mean that you end up with a population of people who are sticking around only for the money, which can kind of bring its own cultural challenges. So having covered off those different pay strategies, I'll hand you back over to Julian to cover off the last couple of topics with us, including pay conversations with employees. We will certainly have time for questions and answers at the end. So once Julian's wrapped, we will get stuck into that. Over to you, Julian.
Awesome. Thanks, Sylvie. Pay conversations with employees. So we've sort of touched on this a couple of times, and I think we're obviously not saying anything new here when we say it can be a bit of a tense or an emotive conversation, and certainly we've all been, I think, or most people have been in that situation, whether it be on the sort of employee side or the employer side. I've certainly been on both sides myself. But we think there are some tools that we've seen work in terms of how to better manage this sort of thing. And I think a key thing really is to really set yourself up for success early on. So by that I mean really being clear with expectations, being transparent, and preventing any surprises. So I guess fundamentally you want to make sure that yourself and the employer are speaking the same language. And I think in too many instances, you've got an employee who thinks that they're sort of awesome and doing all this stuff over here that they're not being rewarded for. And then from the employer or the manager's standpoint, they're sort of looking at a sort of completely different criteria for assessing performance or pay or whatever you like. And the two things are, might be slightly overlapping, but certainly not sort of identical expectations. So I think we want to be clear with employees from the outset around, how we measure performance, or how we review pay. Is it based purely on individual performance, or is it both performance and values, or is it not even performance altogether? Is it, or individual performance at all? Is it based on the business's overall performance and how you've sort of contributed to that overall business performance? And certainly a key thing here, I think, is really having those sort of performance development conversations. Having the clarity around goals and objective setting, assisting in sort of defining how things will be, measured from the outset. Understand and identify top performers. Look for role models within the business that employees can see, and obviously want to track and monitor those things as well, so we can be as transparent as possible. I think we also want to be prepared and support decisions with data. So, we want to be able to explain to employees how decisions were made or are made when it comes to pay, so that they can have faith in that system. So they can see, what's the data that's sort of that's being measured around assessing their performance or the business's overall performance. And so in doing that, we want to review the job, how the employee is contributing to the job. We want to have clear criteria around performance expectations. And I think a really key part of that as well is to really understand the market as well. So reviewing broader than just the individual. We want to sort of have a broader look of our business versus other businesses, similar roles, and so on and so forth. A useful thing can be distinguishing pay discussions from individual performance reviews. So it's often helpful to separate, performance and pay discussions altogether, because what can happen is it can sort of blur the lines. So when we're talking about performance, we really want the employee to be focused on performance and not on anything else, really. We want them to sort of understand the goals, the objectives, and what they need to do to get there, and sort of talk about pay to the side as a sort of separate discussion. So pay discussions are about the individual's performance. So that's where, we're sort of separating those sort of things out, and we're not distorting the conversation. So some roles really can be, I think fundamentally what we're saying as well is, some roles can only, produce so much value, for a business. So you can have someone performing a role that's, they're performing at sort of 100% capacity in terms of their performance. But that role is only going to be so valuable. And by comparison to another role, it's difficult to sort of make comparisons. So once you get to talking about performance rather than pay itself, that's where you can sort of get to this sort of false economy where someone's performing to their absolute best, but is still not reaching their sort of ultimate pay expectations. We sort of want to limit that sort of distortion around how we discuss pay and performance, and really focus performance on performance and pay on pay, and they can be two separate conversations. I think an important thing is, and sort of going back to some of the earlier points that have been made, is really checking for bias in decision making. So again, this is where the importance of data in terms of how we measure performance and in differences in performance, rather than relying on instinct or perceptions, which are still obviously happens quite a bit. And considering what is being measured, are we measuring things that sort of could be considered sort of gendered behaviours, or sort of disadvantage someone with some characteristics at the expense of another's. I think a really important part as well that's often lost in these conversations is we really want to reinforce the employee's value beyond the pay. So to keep an employee happy, engaged, productive, and retain them, as we've mentioned, money will only go so far. So it's likely, other things around like how they're managed, how much autonomy they have, friendships that they have in the workplace, how their work and performance is recognised sort of day to day will go so much further than, a pay increase. There was a study from Great Place to Work which showed that the most important drivers for great work, this was 37%, which is the highest of all the categories, was how employees are recognised, and basically just recognising employees day to day. So sort of keys for employee recognition, being specific and relevant and timely, considering customised recognition and gifts and that sort of thing as well. And also recognising that little things go a long way. I know myself where I've been on sort of receiving end of pay conversations. I can remember conversations that occurred sort of 7 or 8 years ago where I remember the really positive feedback much more than whether or not I even got a pay increase as part of that conversation. I don't even remember. But the sort of much more memorable thing is the how I was valued as part of the company and the team, and talking about development and that sort of thing far more than any sort of pay conversation. And I think another really cool thing that continues to happen is much more and more employers are thinking outside of the box. And we see it every day with our clients and discussions we have with them. So we've got heaps of clients in the sort of IT sort of space, and obviously it's a really hot market at the moment for that sort of IT skill set. And a lot of these clients, and we're working with them to sort of think about how they want to remunerate and recognise their employees. So a lot of the time they're looking at things like retention bonuses. So to stick it, staying with the employer for a certain period of time and recognising that as part of like a retention bonus. Obviously tying pay to performance as well. I think a big side effect of this is sort of investing in youth. So, potentially rather than paying overs to get somebody in who may or may not sort of fit in with the team, and may not perform the work that necessarily the way we want to, is sort of investing in youth and bringing someone in that we can sort of train from the ground up and become a really valuable member of the team as well. And obviously, sort of non-monetary benefits as well is becoming a greater and greater thing. So I think as well, like employers need to we need to continue to think about the true costs of recruiting and inducting employees as well. Is it worth sort of putting the money into to retain someone rather than sort of taking the punt and sort of going out to the market and bringing someone in who may or may not work, and the sort of costs and potential consequences that may come with that. Okay, so if employees are unhappy, this is obviously a reality of all this sort of stuff. The sort of first point we got there is you set up a plan for the employee to achieve to get them to sort of the next pay increase. So I think goal setting's key, transparency around what the employee needs to do, get the employees buy-in, really sort of take the focus away from where we didn't sort of hit the mark last time, but this is what we need to do. These are the sort of role models within the business that, I think really set the expectations around, what's valued within the business in terms of performance, values, so on and so forth. And this is what we need to be working for. Or, there's opportunities that are sort of coming up down the track. Let's sort of put in a bit of a development plan to sort of work you towards being able to step into that role down the track as well. I think a big one is really encouraging employees to test their value in the market as well, and to do their own research. So we've all had employees say that they should be paid more, and we hear people talk about this sort of stuff as well. A good way to sort of put it to the test is really sort of responding to the employees and say, look, go out to the market and sort of see what you're worth for your talent, and come back to us. Really, what sort of rate are you attracting out there in the market? Would be interested to hear. And again, it sort of goes to that transparency and sort of having that sort of information at hand to consider and consider into our decision making as well. And it sort of puts the onus back onto the employee as well. It's like, well, we've got this system around how we set remuneration and all the rest, and we think it's a really good way of doing it. However, if you think otherwise, then put it to the test. We obviously want to keep you on board, and we're happy to sort of accept any feedback or feedback that you get, when you do that. I think reinforce the overall package, including non-monetary benefits, so flexibility, and that sort of thing. So ultimately, I think from an employee standpoint, particularly if they're a good performer and a valuable member of a team, changing jobs is a risk. But I think we need to sort of point out to them that maybe they're not factoring everything into their decision making or into their overall package within the business. So reminding them of you're in an awesome team, you have an awesome manager, you've got these added benefits around additional leave and work from home and flexibility. We've got a clear sort of transparent pathway around growth opportunities for the future as well. This is the sort of meaning that you can get out of this job. And this is how we deliver for our clients and so on and so forth. And this is how you individually do it. That might not be something that they can get from another job that's going to pay them a certain amount higher. I think the thing is overall is really don't be afraid to have a frank conversation with the employee. Don't shy away from conversations. If anything, they probably should be more frequent and less formal. I think a big mistake that some or a lot of employers make is, whether it's about pay or performance, is they're sort of not talking to employees. They're not sort of setting expectations. It's sort of delaying the discussion. In turn, it sort of increases the stakes somewhat, and it puts a bit more pressure on ourselves and potentially makes it, that more much of a sort of an emotive discussion than what it needs to be. And certainly, conducting things like sort of stay interviews, maybe not calling them stay interviews, but really just checking in with employees and helping to understand and understanding, why they work for the organisation and what they value about the organisation and why they stay as opposed to leaving. Sort of just really getting a sense for what our employees value when it comes to this sort of stuff. And again, it goes to that sort of open dialogue and goes to engagement and showing that we care. And also the sort of focus being broader than just pay as well. So I think from our standpoint, obviously, and going back to it and looking at sort of remuneration strategies and looking at pay conceptually, obviously pay is really important. But we think it's important to also consider the entire employee value proposition as well. So it's pay as well as the meaning that can be derived from a particular profession or working for a particular company. The work-life balance that can be offered and flexibility that can come with a particular role. Looking at how we build a team and a culture within the business that's really going to be valued by the market, and how we can sell that in terms of attracting and retaining staff. Obviously, development is a great one. Everyone, most people don't want to sort of just stay sort of stagnant in a role. They want to, we're always sort of working towards something else, and it's sort of like, how can we contribute to that further development? And work content's a big one as well. Whether it's around how work is allocated or how much autonomy someone has with their work, down to, the actual content of their work and how they perform it, and really understanding, and sort of really understanding how that can contribute. So yeah, that is really what we wanted to go through today. And I think, Sylvie, there have been some questions I've seen pop up. Should we tackle those?
Yeah, absolutely. Should we take a one on, one off, and I'll ask one and then you ask one, and we can share our thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. I'll jump in. So Anonymous has asked, with the separation of pay and performance, how do you suggest we engage that process? Could it be days apart or months apart? How do we run that?
Good question. And as I think back, I really feel as though I butchered the explanation of what I was trying to go through there. I suppose how it's, the frequency and that sort of thing, I'm not sure. Your pay might be linked to, say, like a financial year and business performance or something like that. Whereas, individual performance, that might just be run, a completely separate cycle. And that could just be ongoing discussions, ongoing check-ins, and that sort of thing. I think the key thing is it's really just, you just want to create that distinction between, when we sort of talk about pay and that sort of thing versus, when we're sort of switched on to talk about performance and really focus on, goals and recognizing, really, really good performance without sort of talking about pay. I think that's sort of the key thing. Okay, so I'm just looking at the questions now. Sorry, just running through the questions. What do we have here? Someone saying that they're testing their market value seems a bit risky. Someone's feeling undervalued. They may take that as an invitation to start looking elsewhere or get offers. I don't know if you've got any comments around that, Sylvie.
I've got comments for days, Julian. You know me. So I think there is a certain level of trust that would be required for that to be kind of an effective component of a pay discussion. So certainly where I can see it being helpful would be to say, hey, Sylvie, you've asked for a pay rise from 50 grand to 60 grand. Look, we've done our own research and we think that fair pay for your role is now 53.5, let's say. So yeah, there's been a bit of movement, but not the 10K you're asking for. Here's how we've got there. Here's what we've looked at. You know how we manage pay in the rest of the business. So that's kind of what we think is fair, and that's what we're prepared to offer you. And at that point, if the employee was to kick up a fuss and if I was to go ripping and screaming and pulling out of the room, later it might be a conversation to say, well, look, we're really happy to see what you can find that you think is fair. So you're welcome to go and do your own research. Look, to be honest, Sylvie, if you wanted to go talk to a recruiter and see what they would pay you, we want us both to think that you're being paid fairly, so you're welcome to kind of go and do your own research. So I think that's probably how I would couch that more, rather than to say, Sylvie, we're talking about pay, go and see if anyone else will hire you before we'll talk to you about an increase. Obviously, that's going to get you a different outcome than saying, let's be transparent. If you can share what you can find, we'll do the same, and then we can kind of all be working off the same information. Yeah,
completely agree with you. And I think that's sort of the point of sort of looking at all this sort of stuff and sort of it's sort of looking at it from like a strategy standpoint. Not all of it's going to work or even be appropriate for every business, but it's sort of considering, in our circumstance and given the conversations we're having with employees, and maybe this is a good way to tackle it in the right circumstances. So yeah, completely agree with your point.
Totally. Anonymous asks, can you tell people that they have reached the ceiling of their pay band and that their role doesn't have further possibilities of a pay increase? If yes, how do you then keep these employees engaged?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly I've worked places in the past that had quite transparent pay bands that had salary ranges and that sort of thing. So you knew where you were in the range and whether for your job or job classification you were sort of at the peak. So I think you could, say that to someone. obviously you're wanting to keep it open as possible. And if you're not sort of working for the government or sort of a large bureaucratic organisation, then you probably don't want to sort of place caps on people or positions or whatever. So you really want to sort of keep it as open as possible, I think. But if you're in that position, I mean, really, you're wanting to create motivation through, I think, development opportunities. Really, it's sort of like thinking about what's the next sort of steps in your career, where you're sort of working towards. How can we assist in making that happen? So it's sort of, again, it's sort of looking at not just the pay, it's the sort of other things that we can add to the situation. They're looking at the sort of the entire sort of value proposition for working with the business, not just the remuneration.
I would totally agree with your comment around agree on a next step. If it's not a pay increase or there's no possibility of pay increases, as long as you can agree on a next step, that'll solve your problem 80% of the time.
100% or 80%.
Yeah.
All right, I've got to remember to actually look at the questions so I'm prepared for my turn. Any tips on how to have conversations before the person has actually left? I had a situation last year with 2 weeks. Yeah, okay, so how do we prevent ourselves from getting to a point where someone actually leaves?
Totally. I think your comment, Julian, from earlier in the session around less formal and more frequent could almost be a mission statement for HR and for people management. So if you already are having maybe monthly check-ins with your employees or quarterly check-ins with your employees, that's your time to see how things are going and if there's anything they're unhappy with. I think getting caught out by someone resigning either meant they didn't trust you and weren't being truthful when you were having conversations with them, or more commonly, you didn't prioritise taking the time to understand what was going on with them. So that's not intended to be a criticism, but shit happens, we're all busy. If you don't have kind of regular booked conversations with your team to check in with them, you will miss stuff eventually and it will come back to bite you. So less formal, more frequent check-ins. If you run engagement surveys, if you've got those kinds of tools, that can be quite helpful. But certainly making sure that on top of doing that, your employees trust you to be truthful about kind of what they're thinking about and what their plans might be. Building trust is obviously a whole other year of webinars, but certainly making the space for that information to come up to you is really important.
Cool.
And then question for you, Julian, how do you improve pay transparency within your business to prevent quiet conversations and comparisons being made between employees?
Good question. Really good question, actually. Look, it is, I don't think there's any 100% correct way of going about doing it, doing that. I think, and it can be easier in some organisations than others. So, like if you've got, a range of, say, employees performing a similar role, then it might be easier to sort of have like a bit of a hierarchy around, what's paid for at each sort of, at each level, and then sort of rewarding for performance on top of that as well. So perhaps you've got this situation whereby, for this role, this is what, we pay at this level within the organisation, or this is what we pay, or how we reward for as a sort of baseline for each of these roles within the company. But for really top performance, we pay in addition to that, and we reward and recognise performance accordingly. So yeah, I think that's probably a good starting point, is if you've got that sort of, sort of hierarchy, or perhaps not hierarchy is the right word, but that sort of structure around, similar position types or similar responsibility levels, and then sort of having, it doesn't need to be necessarily a sort of hard and fast banding type arrangement, but sort of having a sort of guideline around, at this level, this is a sort of the range that we pay, and so on and so forth. And so everyone's sort of got a general idea of what's, what's paid for each sort of level, and then you can sort of pay for performance on top of that. I've got one, Sylvie, which has probably got your name written all over it. So how would you deal with pay parity created by the minimum wage increase this year, which is 6%?
Yeah, great question. So in New Zealand, the minimum wage is increasing from $20 to $21.20. I think that's the number. I do need to check it. I haven't looked at it for a couple of days. It's a question that comes up every single year. There's a minimum wage increase. So certainly in environments like retail or hospitality, where there are smaller gaps between more senior levels in the organisation, when the floor lifts, it kind of messes with that whole structure, right? Because suddenly you are getting paid what your supervisor's getting paid or what your boss was getting paid. Right. So organisations have a couple of choices. One is to take the percentage of the minimum wage increase and just apply that flat across the organisation. Right. So if your minimum wage team get a 6% increase, so does everyone else. That's the quickest mathematical way to do it, I guess. The trick is then your entire wage bill goes up by 6% when maybe your revenue hasn't at the same time. So it can be a bit delicate to negotiate what that looks like. The answer that is most pragmatic is to sit down and assess where your pay rates are now going to be out of whack, because probably not every single role is going to require a 6% increase for there to still be like a sensible distinction between your seniors and your minimum wage team. But it's likely that minimum wage increases, particularly where you've got smaller gaps between your layers, if not your hierarchy, is going to require some increases for other members of the business to make sure that that internal pay parity, so within your kitchen, all of your appliances then are kind of being paid what's fair given their contributions.
Right. Interesting. I have to say I read that question to you, not really properly understanding what it was actually about. So that's actually fascinating. So I hadn't thought of that. And I suppose from like an Australian context with the award system, if there's a minimum wage increase, it's sort of applied to every classification in the award. So in a sort of retail setting, if the sort of store assistant is getting an increase, that's also being applied to the store manager who's covered by the same. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right, question from Craig. Kia ora, Craig. Thanks for joining us. Does MyHR have any templates and or suggestions to use to help explain how much value the business is offering to an individual, which would include all the non-monetary benefits? I've been at MyHR a bit longer than you, Julian, so I'm happy to speak to that if that'd be wonderful. Yeah. It's a mean question. Sorry, mate. So the short answer is yes, MyHR can work with you to prepare whatever communication is appropriate for your business and your team to talk about the value that they get from working with you. So at the formal end, this could be a document which in HR speak would be an employee value proposition kind of policy. So to say, here's how we make sure our pay rates are fair, and then we talk about what you do. So whether you get a pay consultant in every 2 years, whether you check the market, what happens there. We then go into all of the other stuff. So the team and the culture, the development opportunities, the fact that you have an amazing MyHR platform in the back end to manage performance reviews, the flexibility, the sabbaticals, the flowers on birthdays, all of that stuff goes into this employee value proposition kind of document. At the lower admin kind of end, we're here to help you manage conversations with your team, sometimes on a one-to-one basis around this value. So if you were having people coming up to you and asking either in a gracious way or an aggressive way kind of to defend your pay rates, we can help kind of write bullet points for conversations for you. We can help write emails and reply. So whether you want a full-on document if you're a larger organisation to talk about employee value for the employee, or if you kind of just need some help on an ad hoc basis responding to these queries, that's definitely something MyHR can help with. So get in touch if that's some support that would be of interest to you. Cool. I'll jump into the chats and pull one up for you then, because that was a bit of a mean question to send your way. So Victoria asks, what were the 4 pillars that Julian mentioned earlier in the webinar? Could we
yeah. Okay, so this is, I think we're talking about retention. And so looking at high levels of retention engagement, so performance management, remuneration, rewards and recognition, and succession management as well. So those are the sort of keys that I'll sort of referring to in terms of, looking at retention just outside of just remuneration? So looking at it a bit more strategically, or a bit broader than that.
I've typed that in for Victoria, so thank you.
I actually had one. I'm not sure if you answered this one. Pay parity. You mentioned employee skill sets. How is this balanced with the skills required for the role? If individuals are highly skilled, however, the role requires a lower skill set, how does parity come into play? The role is the role. This is what is structured around the job evaluation of market. Yeah, so basically the roles at this level, but someone has sort of a greater skill set than what's required.
Totally. The question then comes back to what value does it add for your business? So if you hired someone who was a rocket scientist to be a science teacher at a high school, they would only be getting high school teacher pay rates, right? So there is not usually an expectation that if you come with a bucket full of awesome skills that you have, that your job is only this big. I haven't come across very many circumstances where an employee still wants their rocket scientist salary even for their kind of teacher job. So being really clear with your job description, kind of how big the job is. And then to your point, Esther, absolutely talking about what value it brings to the business, looking at comparable roles, so like for like, what would they get paid in this role in market or in other organisations, will help you keep a lid on their expectations, even that if they're a NASA superstar, they're still only doing a science teacher's job, so they only get paid for being a science teacher. Cool. Jumping into Maureen says, hi Maureen, nice to talk to you. We are looking at potentially providing more annual leave as part of our remuneration review. So we'll be giving our team the choice to either get a pay raise or to be given more annual leave. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I think it's quite a good approach. It's a flexible approach. And yeah, it's providing, I suppose, options to the employee. So, you couldn't be accused of being rigid with how you recognise performance or whatever. So I actually think that's quite a nice approach. What do you think, Sylvie?
I'm really supportive. I think certainly for people who are in higher paid roles, and I'm thinking kind of senior salaried employees, extra money kind of only goes so far. But an extra week of leave in New Zealand is 25% more time off during a year. Like, I would put my hand up for that. I turn a raise down to get more time off every year. So I think as a tool to give your employees more choice, I think it's fabulous. I would be really interested, Maureen, to hear how it goes for you and your team. But yeah, it sounds like you've got 2 ticks from us. So yeah, great place to start.
Cool. Has employee retention changed in recent years with the impacts of COVID?
The short answer is yes, it has, but maybe not in ways that you would expect. So, and I'm going to speak to a New Zealand context here and then maybe hand over to Julian for some Aussie commentary. So certainly in the first couple of years of the pandemic, people battened down the hatches and did not friggin' move. Like, people were really worried about what it was going to look like. Was society as we know it going to collapse? So there was much reduced turnover in those roles across industry that we saw. We published a report, I'm going to get the dates wrong, but I think it was the middle of last year, after about a year and a half of pandemic stuff, where we looked at categories of employment across New Zealand. And what we saw was that permanent employees were not being ditched for casual and fixed term employees, but certainly there were more casual and fixed term employees, because as people kind of left or resigned, there was an increase in businesses wanting flexibility. So employee retention was very high to start with. Then there were some kind of structural changes where businesses were not firing their permanent employees, but just wanting a bit of flexibility when they could get it, which made sense. Certainly in the last 5 to 6 months in New Zealand, there has been an enormous increase in movement among candidates. And I would say retention has dropped because New Zealand has no migrants coming in. We have a growing economy, borders are closed, so expats can't come back, and there's heaps of stuff happening. So it's incredibly hard at the moment to find talent, again, across industry. People are very willing to look over the fence and seeing what's happening next door. So the pattern of retention across the pandemic, to my knowledge, was retention increased because people were freaking out and didn't want to lose their job. Retention kind of then equalised and stayed about the same, with employers hiring more flexible kind of engagements when they brought people on, and then retention dropping as we're now in New Zealand in a really hot talent market where there's lots going on. So that's been the New Zealand kind of story. Julian, is that track with Australia or?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. I think, there was that initial part where we're sort of doing everything to keep business and employees afloat, and obviously government support to assist with that as well. But then there was obviously the sort of casual and fixed term employees who were a bit of the, a lot were initially let go. And then it's, as you say, it's stabilised. And I think Australia's been in a very similar trajectory as New Zealand. I mean, I think from my own standpoint, as someone who left, who changed jobs during the pandemic, I certainly feel as though the pandemic was a bit of a motivating factor as well for me to sort of evaluate my life and my work and what I really value and that sort of thing as well. So I think undoubtedly, I think that's been a contributing factor as well.
Totally. And look, we're now over time by 6 minutes, and we still have a stack of questions to get through. So thank you to you lot for being a wonderful, engaged audience. We might do one more question for Julian and then wrap up and come back to you later with some views on some of the questions you've asked. But again, thank you. It's been great to have you asking all of these questions. Victoria asks, with something like a retention bonus, have you ever seen this backfire where a low engaged employee might stick around just to get the bonus? Or would you say that if your performance management is in place, then you should be able to avoid that happening?
Yeah, I think the second point's key, and sort of going to, I think it's only appropriate where, it only be appropriate, I think, where you've got a really valuable employee who you really want to retain, and there's who wants to stay as well, but who's got other opportunities out there, and it is a good way to sort of keep them within the business for an extended period of time, or whether it's a skill set that is really sought after, but you may not have the ability to sort of pay at the sort of front end. But yeah, definitely, I think you could get yourself into a position where an employee isn't engaged and isn't performing. So you could have sort of performance expectations that contribute to that, the payment of that bonus. But I think definitely the second point there is key, is you need to have that performance management system. You can't just sort of come to the agreement and then sort of everyone sort of closes their eyes and, we get 12 months down the track and we've had a really poor performer, getting a sort of bonus on top. We need to sort of be onto that and managing that throughout that period.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome, thank you.
Cool.
Well, look, we will wrap it up there. Just some really quick housekeeping before we say goodbye to you all. The session has been recorded and will be available afterwards on all of the MyHR kind of platforms. You'll be able to come back and watch this or jump in if you missed anything. Again, thank you so much for all your questions. It really, as you can tell, is quite energising and makes a difference where we do have a big stack of stuff to talk about. So thank you. If there was a question you asked that was unanswered, we will do our very best to come back to you probably by email just to give you a couple of thoughts. If there's anything in here that has triggered some ideas for you or that you'd like to explore in more detail, that email address again is help@myhr.works. So help@myhr.works. And I know Julian and I would be very happy to continue this conversation afterward. So with that said, again, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really robust session, and I'd like to thank Julian as well for being my co-pilot during this webinar. You'll certainly be seeing more of us over the next couple of months with more of these Trans-Tasman sessions. I wonder if some Ask Me Anything sessions could be helpful given the amount of questions around this kind of pay stuff. So we'll take that back as a suggestion. But again, any feedback, super welcome. Drop your questions through to help@myhr.works, and we very much look forward to seeing you at the next one. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you then.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Cheers.